So next up, podcast listeners, Randi Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, she was talking to Charles Blow of the New York Times. And he used to be a graphics editor at the New York Times, by the way, Charles Blow. And now he's like one of the editorial writers there, So I'm just curious, like how do you start out the New York Times and you're like doing the graphics work and you're an editor and then suddenly you're like one of the chief writers there in terms of their op-ed page. How does that work? I mean, it shows you, how low their standards have become. Well, anyway, he was interviewing Randi Weingarten about CRT, critical race theory. And you'll love what Randi Weingarten says about critical race theory. Here it is.
Which is all of a sudden you're hearing people talk about critical race theory, people who have no idea what that term means, or trying to ban the 1619 Project because it is trying to do exactly what you're saying, which is to actually teach a factual version of oppression in America. Oppression against people who are in the indigenous nation, and oppression against people who were enslaved.
So what she's missing here, of course, Randi Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, is that the oppression that she's talking about is oppression that occurred a long time ago. What she's trying to do and what the American Federation of Teachers is attempting, and the Democrat Party, they're trying to convince people by indoctrination in K-12 that oppression is occurring today. Not that oppression occurred in history, which it should be taught, and that oppression, especially oppression of slavery, was wrong. But she's trying to teach that that is still continuing today in the United States of America. That is the goal. How do I know this? Because a teacher in my own community, a community that is conservative, certainly right of center, a teacher in my own community sent me training materials, and the training materials gave me an up-down chart. And the up-down chart is this chart that says, here's where you are on the oppression table. If you're white and Protestant, then you're at the top. You have white privilege. And by definition, in the 21st century in America, you are the bad guy because you have way too much privilege by virtue of the color of your skin and by your religion. All the stuff that we were taught we weren't supposed to believe in, but this is what Randi Weingarten wants to teach students. And I'm bringing this CRT stuff up again because there is a whole litany of things that's happening in America's public school system that parents are finally, and I say finally because they really haven't been paying attention until COVID when their kids were learning from home. Parents are finally paying attention to these things. So one example is CRT, but another is a school sends flyers home with 8th grade students advising on the age of consent and getting abortions without permission. This is in the Washington Examiner. And the Washington Examiner reported the following. A Washington school district sent flyers home with 8th grade students that contained information on abortions without parental consent and outlining age of consent laws for students as young as 11 years old. The flyer is not part of our curriculum and should not have been sent home with students, Eric Hogan, Tacoma Public Schools Assistant Director of Secondary Education, told parents in an email. Previously, Planned Parenthood taught within our schools and supplied the flyer that was distributed to students. So this is in Tacoma Park, Maryland. This says Washington. So it's a suburb of Washington, D.C., but it's technically in the state of Maryland. So again, Tacoma Park Public Schools Assistant Director Eric Hogan said, well, in the past, Planned Parenthood was the one that taught within our schools and supplied the flyer that was distributed to the students. What do you think Planned Parenthood is teaching in the schools? Are they teaching safe sex? Maybe. But what else are they teaching? They're teaching about abortion on demand anytime, no matter the month, and that there are no consequences to anyone, including the baby itself. So the flyer which was posted online by a concerned parent, advised students that they can get an abortion at any age without parental consent and purchase condoms regardless of their age. Can you believe that? The flyer, which posted online by a concerned parent, advised students they can get an abortion at any age without parental consent. They don't need their parents to know anything, and purchase condoms regardless of their age. The Planned Parenthood material also informed students about laws regarding the age of consent, with one example being that they were allowed to have sex at the age of 11 with a person who is 2 years younger or older than them. It also promoted Plan B emergency contraception, noting that middle schoolers can buy it at any age from the pharmacy. Hogan insists that the distribution of the flyers was a mistake. By Hogan, I'm talking about Hogan, who is one of these school administrators. We discovered a binder of curriculum materials was left behind for an incoming teacher to use for this year, and this flyer was in the binder. Not realizing the flyer wasn't approved material, the teacher sent it home with the students, Hogan said. Podcast listeners, do not believe a word of that statement. There are so many teachers who are wonderful people, and I believe most of them are, but there are plenty of teacher activists who believe their function is to sexualize children, and to do so in a way that in most times, and including under current law, would probably require them to be incarcerated, because this individual should be incarcerated. Or at the very least, if he's saying it's a mistake, he should be fined. He should be fined, and the fine should be pretty massive so that it doesn't happen again. Don't believe for a moment that the materials were unapproved and just happened to be in the binder, and not realizing the flyer wasn't approved. The teacher sent it home with the students. Why was the flyer in the binder to begin with? I mean, come on. And so the consequence of all of this is that public school enrollment has dropped 3% nationwide. Public school enrollment has dropped 3% nationwide. The number of students attending public schools during the 2020-21 academic year fell by 3% compared with the previous year. The data comes from the National Center for Educational Statistics, a federal agency that analyzes education figures. The 3% drop represents some 1.5 million students no longer going to public schools, according to the preliminary report. A final report will not be available until next spring, according to NCES. Figures come from reports generated by state departments of education. So each state provides this information, and what they found is that 1.5 million less students are going to public schools, which means they're going to private schools, or they are being homeschooled. And they're being homeschooled because of all of the things that we just discussed. Randi Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, talking about the oppression of modern day students, all of whom are non-white because the white people are oppressing them, and that's being taught today, and it's being taught as current events and history. And of course, the up-down chart that I discussed, and that schools are sending home flyers with eighth graders about the fact they don't need consent if they want to get abortion, even if they're 11 years old. So parents are pulling their kids out. They are voting with their feet, and they're marching away.